Use of rhetoric. Devices and techniques meant to sway. When language is deliberately unclear or loaded, it falls under the heading of rhetoric. Rhetoric is language used intentionally, primarily for the purpose of influencing others' beliefs, attitudes, and behavior. In this section, you'll learn about several common forms of rhetoric that you should be on the lookout for. A euphemism is a term used specifically to produce a neutral or positive reaction in people. For example, referring to a car as pre-owned rather than used is using a euphemism to convey a more positive image than the term used car usually does. Dysphemisms, on the other hand, are meant to bring out a negative reaction. For example, calling the paper version of a publication that can be found online the Dead Tree Edition is substituting the phrase that has very negative connotations for a more neutral phrase. If you're making arguments, try to be neutral in your descriptions, relying on facts and logic to make your argument. If you're hearing or reading arguments, you should be aware of the author's motives in the choice of their words. Stereotypes are another way that arguments can be affected by language choices. Stereotypes are thoughts or images about a group of people based on little or no evidence. Stereotypes are often incorporated in rhetorical claims in order to support arguments based on generalizations. They may use individual cases to draw conclusions about an entire group. Often, stereotypes can be used to downplay the achievements or appearance of someone or something by claiming that it's just another of some group, or that someone is a member of some group that, as a whole, cannot be trusted or relied on. While people often assume that stereotypes are negative portrayals, that's not always the case. They can be positive as well. For example, we might talk about someone acting like a gentleman. Arguments can also rely on innuendo, which is a form of expression used to make a specific claim without actually stating that claim. Innuendo is used to imply or suggest something in such a way that anyone listening should get what is meant without being stated. Reading innuendo is a way of reading between the lines. Do you catch my drift? Let's say a friend asked you what you thought of a particular professor. You reply, "He's a good teacher, in some ways." Now, you probably shouldn't be surprised if your friend then asks, "Well, what do you mean, some ways?" In using that qualifying phrase, you have suggested that there are some ways in which he's not a good teacher, although you didn't actually say that. One particular form of innuendo is the loaded question. Loaded questions are questions asked in such a way as to imply that something has happened or is still happening. For example, if your parents ask you, "So have you finally gotten your act together in school?" suggests that, at least in the past, you were having some problems in school, even though they didn't actually mention those past problems. Weaslers is a term invented to describe hedging a bet with language. It means inserting words or phrases into a claim that weaken or modify the claim somewhat in ways that can protect it from challenges. Weaslers can be especially effective to make an argument that appears to stand up to critical evaluation. For example, consider an advertisement that says, "Local town bank pays up to 10% more interest on savings accounts." After seeing the ad, you decide to close your current account in some other bank and go to local town bank to open a savings account with them. Some other bank only gave you 5% interest, so you're excited to get 15% interest. Imagine your dismay when you find out you would actually only get 4% interest on your account. "But your ad said 10% more, that's false advertising," you exclaim. "No," the local town bank rep says. "Our ad says we pay up to 10% more, but not always 10% more. Plus, that's actually up to 10% more than some banks, but not all of them." We've all heard arguments that declare something's the worst ever, or that a minor scrape is the most painful injury in the world. These are hyperbole, and they can be used to prop up someone or something, as in claims about the greatest athlete to ever live. Or it can be used to undermine, as in referring to your parents as fascists anytime they restrict your activity. It may seem easy to dismiss hyperbole when evaluating claims, but even if you're alert to it and recognize the exaggeration, you still need to be careful that the use of hyperbole doesn't sway you to believe the underlying claim. So say that I claim that LeBron James is the best athlete ever in any sport. You may readily hesitate before simply accepting the full claim, but you might automatically agree that he is extraordinary, without actually critically assessing that statement by looking at the hard evidence. Our final way that language can be used to override truth and logic is called rhetorical analogy. Reasoning by analogy involves two objects or situations. The analogy is supposed to help us understand the object or situation we're thinking about by referring to the other one, which is already understood. So, for example, when we compare the heart to a pump, we're making an analogy. We understand how a pump works, and the analogy helps us understand how the heart works. But in a rhetorical analogy, the comparison can be misleading. The comparison is used to make the object or situation we're considering to appear better or worse than it actually is. The basis for comparison is specifically chosen for its positive or negative qualities, so that the subject at issue can then be shown in a positive or negative light. Analogies are often used in inductive arguments. Drawing an analogy between something that is accepted or known can be a useful way to build an argument for something that's similar but uncertain. However, rhetorical analogies are deliberately structured to persuade people. The analogy is often made without any attempt to actually show how the two examples are related or why you should accept that Exhibit A is a good comparison standard for Exhibit B. For example, suppose someone's arguing that trying to change the direction of the U.S. economy is like trying to turn a large cargo ship. They're using an analogy to make the point that changing the United States economy will not happen quickly. In order to evaluate the argument, you have to ask yourself whether the U.S. economy and a large cargo ship are sufficiently similar to make the analogy credible. As you apply your critical thinking skills to evaluating arguments, you must pay close attention to language and how it's being used. An argument that seems to be very strong because of the words used may be uncovered to be very weak once the claims are subjected to thorough, careful analysis. Remember, the objective of an argument is to present a rational case for a particular conclusion, not to persuade or convince others to agree. If the premises are sound and they're relevant to the conclusion and provide enough justification, then the argument is valid.